It was a flood of epic proportion,
There's nothing to ever compare to this.
creating the worst cemetery disaster in U.S. history.
We lost most of my mother's family.
Out of this horrifying devastation, extraordinary individuals came forward and undertook the amazing task of bringing final rest to the dead and closure to the living. It was called the Great Flood of '93, one of the most costly and devastating floods to ravage the United States in modern history. It flooded 17 million acres over 9 Midwestern states, causing damages totaling more than $12 billion and killing 50 people in Missouri and Illinois. The flood was months in the making, beginning with a wet fall and culminating with torrential rains in the spring. By summer, some places experienced rainfall of up to 4 to 7 inches in 1 hour. The Mississippi and Missouri rivers overflowed to record heights, forcing the evacuation of 85,000 residents. 55,000 homes were damaged or destroyed. The entire region was declared a national disaster.
I've never faced anything in my life that was as devastating as the '93 flood.
Since I've lived in Ray County, there's nothing to ever compare to this. Nothing that I've ever witnessed.
In July, area levees broke near Harden, Missouri, causing rushing waters to flood the town's farmlands and its only cemetery. The force of the water washed out graves, dislodging vaults and caskets.
You would never think water, a resource such as water, could cause as much tragedy as it does when it gets out of control. And with the Missouri River being 8 miles south of us, we never expected that this whole situation would ever happen.
Snow doesn't realize the full extent of the disaster until he gets a call from the governor.
The governor of Missouri was flying over the flooded area when he thought a trash dumpster had turned over in the cemetery. And what he had mistaken to be a trash dumpster was actually a steel vault that had come out of the ground and was laying down in the lower section of the cemetery. Had floated down there.
That sighting is the tip of the iceberg. More calls start coming in, with reports of caskets and vaults and even bodies bobbing up in the water.
The vault started popping out of the ground, and in a vault they're sealed, but there's air that's sealed inside. Well, whenever the water gets deep enough, that vault will become buoyant. And usually when you have a 1,500, 3,000 pound vault, it's going to find a way to the top.
When the floodwaters begin to recede, the full extent of the disaster is visible. Caskets, vaults, embalmed bodies, and skeletal remains are scattered over 26 square miles, an area larger than the island of Manhattan. Of the 1,665 graves originally buried in the Harden Cemetery, nearly half are washed away.
I lost my grandma and grandpa, my mother and dad, my brother, my twin sister, and a younger sister. And an aunt and uncle, they just washed them away. They're not there no more. We lost most of my mother's family that was buried in the cemetery, her mother and dad, her paternal grandparents, a brother, and 2 sisters.
I had friends buried down there that we found one that was completely out of the coffin. down through there, and they had to recover that and put it back, and we cried.
What the people of Hardin are enduring is more than anyone could have imagined. Witnessing floating caskets was the stuff of horror movies, not real life. And to make matters worse, these caskets and vaults contained their loved ones, family and friends, children and parents, people they had already mourned and buried. Now this unbelievable tragedy ignites their grief again. Like others with deep family ties in Hardin, Ed and Linda Wolf are in shock when they realize what happened.
We lost our son Christopher, who was an infant and died at birth in 1975. We lost Ed's set of grandparents on the Wolf side, and we lost Ed's father.
You expect that when you bring a loved one to the cemetery that that's the final resting place. Well, that final resting place was null and void, you know, and that just psychologically really affected a lot of people because their loved ones not where we put them to be finally. And, you know, so it was just quite a traumatic situation.
To this day, bones are still being found.
So what kind of
Forensic anthropologist Elizabeth Murray recently visited the cemetery.
So as the water levels raise and lower at the cemetery, why we keep getting calls of bones and things being washed back up on the surface. As a matter of fact, last week we had a skull wash up and was found on the edge of the lake. So I went down and retrieved it and brought it back up to the facility here.
You have it here?
Yes, ma'am.
So this was just discovered recently?
Yes, just last week.
Has small mastoid processes, fairly smooth brow. It's a relatively small skull. Not a lot of development in here where the neck muscles attach. It kind of has a female size and appearance to it, but I'm sure it'd be another one of your unknowns, wouldn't it?
Oh yes, yes. It'll be given a file folder and I'll photograph it and you know, we'll continue to hold the skull until it can be reburied down at the cemetery. But
how often has this happened that these turn up?
Not very often do we get a full skull. I think we've probably only received about 4. In the summertime after the flood, why when the farmers started reworking their fields for the next planting, why they were discovering several long bones and a few skulls in their fields that lied east of the cemetery.
Harden, Missouri is a small farming town 35 miles east of Kansas City and 6 miles north of the Missouri River. At the time of the '93 flood, the population was 598. Today, it's much the same. It's a tight-knit agricultural town that supports itself by farming soybeans and corn. Ed Wolf grew up here.
A lot of the people were related in some way or another. It was just a concentrated, like a big family is what it was. Someone was always there to help you, back you up, you know, help take care of you.
It was not the first time the small community of Hardin experienced a flood. In 1951, record high water levels in the region caused thousands to abandon their homes, schools, and businesses.
I was told this was worse than the '51 flood. And my mother and dad had planned for another flood, but not any worse, and had raised their home up on blocks about that high, just to be prepared for another one if it did happen. And when I went, drove like less than 2 blocks around the corner to my mother's house, there was no water, on the driveway. And I was told, let's get your mom's house emptied. And 16 of us emptied that house in 1 hour, everything in it. And when Mom and I walked out the front of her house, we had the water was up to our knees in 1 hour. It raised that fast. It was unbelievable.
While the waters are still high in many areas, snow, with the assistance of volunteers and the National Guard, launches small boats to round up the caskets and vaults.
There was a fence row, woven wire fence that ran north and south that was kind of the trap for a lot of the anthropology. The skulls and bones had washed that away and got hung up in that fence. But we found some bodies out of caskets that were 22, 23 miles down east.
The flood doesn't just wash over the surface of the 9-acre Harden Cemetery. It actually cuts a swath right through it, splitting the cemetery in two and creating a permanent lake 30 feet deep. As the days go by and the water pulls back, Snow's volunteers walk across acres looking for bones stuck in the mud. Others drive all-terrain vehicles, combing miles of farmland, gathering up caskets. Eventually, 30,000 acres would be covered by the search.
In Ray County, we figured we could handle 50 bodies without having any outside help. When we discovered that we were going to exceed 50 many times over, why, that's when we sent the word out.
Calls go out across the state. Additional funeral directors, anthropologists, and pathologists are desperately needed to deal with the bodies and skeletal remains.
In the Missouri Funeral Directors Association, they have a portion that's called the MFDA Disaster Response Team, and they have been trained in mass fatality disasters.
Vernie Fountain answers Dean Snow's call for help. Vernie is a funeral director and a member of the Missouri Funeral Directors Disaster Response Team. To Fountain, dealing with the displaced coffins presented many unique problems.
Some of them were broken open, so we were dealing with human remains all the way down to skeletal remains that were recovered, all the way up to some containers that would weigh as much as 4,000 pounds. And those were they're called surface mausoleums. There were 5 or 6 of those that were washed out. And of course we had to have wreckers move those. We had forklifts. First operations center was on a farm outside of Richmond. It was a small machine shed, and we began to operate actually off of a card table and a few chairs. We brought in somewhere probably around 100 vaults and or caskets. In the back room, if you will, of the machine shed is where our initial processing started. And caskets were opened. We had a team of people with a checklist, and they would check for things such as wristbands, hospital wristbands that would still be on. A suit, is there a particular lapel pin on the suit of the decedent? What's the color? Things of this nature. And if we could identify by that method, then that, of course, person was then marked as known.
Because of the sheer number of caskets, bodies, and bones, the machine shed quickly becomes overcrowded. A decision is made to move the temporary morgue to the county fairgrounds, where there would be more room to work. One recovery in particular stands out in Fountain's memory.
One of the caskets, when that casket was opened, it turned out to be a veteran. We were able to identify because of dog tags there, and the order was given immediately not to disturb that in any fashion. That was closed. Immediately we placed a flag over that, and that flag stayed over that throughout the operation.
That was a little symbolic thing that people could take a look at and say, well, we're doing some good.
Cassandra Smith.
The residents of Hardin are distraught. They demand that every effort be made to recover and identify their missing friends and family. Town officials respond. Snow explains that every effort is being made. But everyone realizes the likelihood of finding every missing body or bone is highly improbable. Ed Wolf's emotions run high. He is anxious to know whether his father and baby Christopher will be found.
It was just the day-to-day ordeal. You know, are they going to find them? Are they not going to find them? And it was just constant turmoil in that there's nothing you can do about it.
Days turn into weeks, and Snow knows his crew needs even more help.
We established early on that this was going to be a very costly operation, and the President signed the bill that this was going to be a federal disaster, met the qualifications, so then we were able to ask the request of some more professional and forensic people, which the feds helped pay for, to bring them in to do the identification operation.
The federal government promised an assessment team of 5 to help the exhausted crew in Hardin. Even they didn't realize exactly what they were going to be up against. A recovery crew in Harden, Missouri has been working for weeks to retrieve the embalmed and mummified bodies, hundreds of caskets, and thousands of bones washed away from the cemetery by the great Midwest flood of '93. The flood also stirred deep emotions, and Ray County Coroner Dean Snow tries his best to reassure the Hardin residents.
I had a lady whose parents had been deceased for over 30 years, and she was having nightmares every night because she didn't know where they were at. And just needing to know that they had been recovered. And, getting identified was, of course, the bigger factor, but it just psychologically affected people not knowing.
The crew gathers all the remains they can and place them in the makeshift morgue. But the task of identifying Hardin's dead becomes increasingly overwhelming. Vernie Fountain, lead coordinator for the recovery efforts, explains what came next in the operation.
We had to move into a forensic type of operation. In other words, we had to have anthropologists, dental folks, fingerprint people, x-ray technicians, and so on, to begin this, what we call processing.
Both Snow and Fountain realize their crew is still not equipped to identify the many bodies and bones. They know they need additional forensic experts and call DMORT for assistance. DMORT is short for Disaster Mortuary Operational Response Team. The team operates at the federal level, and its mandate is to help local jurisdictions manage the dead in mass disasters. The Harden Cemetery disaster is the group's first deployment.
Had it not been for DMORT, what we would have had to have done would be to just seek out different forensic entities, individuals with the expertise, and just pick them around the country and bring them in. Strangers, this way we had a team of people that came in. They were all professionals.
Since Hardin, DMORT teams, now under the Department of Homeland Security, were activated to help identify the victims of the Oklahoma City bombing, several major air crashes, and the 9/11 attacks. Forensic anthropologist Paul Sledzik joins up with the crew in Hardin when he arrives there. He is the head of the small DMORT assessment team that is sent down to evaluate the scope of the disaster.
From the federal disaster response perspective, this was the first time the forensic anthropologists hadn't had a major role, and it makes sense because most of what we're dealing with are skeletal remains.
Sledzik is well aware that how we as a society treat the dead goes beyond our feelings for our loved ones.
I think that historically in America, we've always placed a high price on our dead, whether it be from wars or from our own families. And I think particularly at Hardin, people felt a connection to this cemetery. This was the only history that the town had. And the town had essentially been wiped out by the floods itself, and then to have its history wiped out as well, I think was kind of a double whammy for them.
In addition to Sledzik, the assembled crew includes 3 funeral directors and a mortuary search and recovery expert from the Department of Defense. At the time of the Harden Cemetery disaster, Sledzik was a curator at the National Museum of Health and Medicine.
Center. This is very similar to a lot of the embalmed remains we saw at Hardin. This is a head and upper torso of a young girl that was embalmed in Kentucky in the late 1800s using an arsenic method. But the shape and the consistency of this particular specimen is very similar to those we were seeing at the Harden Cemetery. This cemetery goes back to the Civil War, right up to the present time. So you had almost 800 burials in this cemetery that represented that particular time period.
The people in Hardin's oldest graves were most likely not embalmed and were buried in wooden caskets, so these bodies would have decomposed long ago. The practice of embalming only became widespread after the Civil War, when huge numbers of dead needed to be preserved so they could be shipped home. Because the National Museum of Health and Medicine is also a research facility, they were permitted to keep some of the unidentified bones from Hardin.
In this cabinet here, we've got some of the skeletal material from Hardin. Some of the long bones, different bones. But let's take it over on the other table. When the floodwaters hit this cemetery, these got washed out into the 25 square miles worth of farmland. We've got some vertebral osteoarthritis and fusion going on there.
You can see it on either side here.
Right, the bony bridging there. This is a dislocated shoulder. This is the scapula, the shoulder blade.
Yeah, that's so polished there from the wear.
Right, and that's right, you got the bone-on-bone eburnation. And that's just very severe. All the cartilage was destroyed.
But this shiny surface shows us this person was using their arm, and that's what puts the shine on there, because bone is rubbing on bone in an abnormal way.
Exactly.
The DMORT group works to determine the total number of skeletal remains, and therefore the number of people they are dealing with.
Or for the individual bones, what we would do is divide them by the bone, whether it's the humerus, the upper arm bone, or the femur, the upper leg bone, and then divide them by side, left versus right, and then seriate them. We'd put the largest bones towards the center of a long table, and then make them smaller as we went out from that central point, and then count them all, get an idea of how many people were represented by all these individual elements.
In anthropology, we call that the minimum number of individuals.
Sledzik says that if a skull is reasonably intact, it's counted as one individual. Partial skulls, however, could simply have resulted from breakage. The skull count produces a minimum of 129 people, represented now only by bones.
We would come to work every morning. There'd be a couple boxes full of bones that the search teams had brought in. We'd start to clean them off, and then we'd divide them by skeletal elements. We would have all the humeri on one set of tables, all the femora, the upper leg bones on another set of tables.
After cleaning and sorting the bones by body side and then by size, Paul and his crew use standard forensic anthropology procedures, beginning with the measurement of each bone. In adult remains, measurements can help separate males and females. Measuring the bones from children can provide an estimate of how old the child was when he or she died, but cannot sort boys from girls.
What we'll do is take the long bone, this is a humerus, the upper arm bone, and we measure the length of it. This is about 124 millimeters long. And we take that measurement and we compare it to a set of standards that were developed on known age children with the same bone measurement. So by doing that, we're able to determine how old this child is at the time of their death.
In addition to estimations of sex and age, specific bones can often provide more information that can help individualize or identify a set of remains, like baby Christopher.
That we had from Hardin. Well, to determine sex, we would look at the pelvic bones, which is our standard method of doing it. To determine race, we would look at the skull. We knew in this particular cemetery that they were all Caucasian based on the records that we were able to find. We'd look at all the bones for pathological conditions, gunshot wounds, healed fractures, things like that.
Even with the combined efforts of Verney Fountain and Dean Snow's volunteers and Sledzik assessment team from Washington, the progress of trying to identify individuals from this many bones and bodies looks like it could take months. Sledzik calls Washington for additional help. In mid-October, nearly 4 months after the cemetery washed out, a group of close to 50, including forensic anthropologists, dentists, pathologists, FBI fingerprint experts, and support personnel join up with the crew in Hardin. The recovery efforts collected approximately 3,400 bones and 408 individuals who were represented by a complete set of remains. Now the people of Hardin wanted to know how soon it would be until the bodies that were found could be identified and returned to them again. It was almost 4 months since the Midwest flood washed away Hardin's historic cemetery. This was a flood for the record books. 95,000 people from 9 Midwestern states were in dire need of help. In Illinois and Missouri, 8,000 property owners sold out and moved to higher ground. The painstaking process of trying to identify the thousands of skeletal remains and hundreds of individuals recovered from the washed-out Harden Cemetery was still going on. It was now in the capable hands of a special crew of experts who knew how to deal with the dead. The psychological impact caused by the flood's devastation continues to take its toll on the residents of Hardin. Psychologists are finding people filled with anxiety and depression and a sense of helplessness. For Linda Renison, waiting for word about lost family members, including her mother's parents, her brothers, and her sisters, is unsettling. And she feels this catastrophe was so traumatic for her mother that it hastened her death.
My mother had just retired the year before in '92. She was 71 years old when she retired from a garment factory that she had worked in. And she was doing fairly well till this all happened. And then she just kind of closed down as far as being interested in anything. It just wore on her mind so bad that it was just a matter of 3 or 4 years and she was in a nursing home. And from then on, she never spoke, never said nothing.
Linda's aunt, Dot Bacchus, relies on her faith while she waits.
I think it's in God's hand. You know, it was just one of those things. So I just live with it.
Ed Wolf feels the anxiety and frustration of many in the town.
You know, have they found anybody? Have they located anyone? Is it, you know, mom's husband, you know, my dad? Is it our baby? You know, it's just a constant thing.
Coroner Dean Snow knows how important it is to keep the lines of communication open.
The main thing that we could do was to keep them informed daily of what was going on here at the cemetery. We'd set up a family assistance center out at the fairgrounds, which people came daily, and we tried to give a update twice a day of letting them know what was going on and if we'd made any identifications, who had been identified.
For the crew in Hardin, the process of identification is extremely complicated. Because the victims of this disaster are already dead, and some of them over 100 years, medical records usually helpful in identifications are not to be found.
This is a picture of my
The
mother.
crew has to come up with other kinds of data to compare with their observations of the bodies. One of the first things they do is ask relatives of the displaced dead for photos. They also ask them if they can recall information about the clothing or any personal property buried with their loved ones. This type of information could help in assigning a presumptive or temporary ID. Linda and Ed Wolf's infant son, Christopher, had been buried for 18 years before the flood.
They asked if we had any pictures at all to bring those. Well, I knew exactly what he was buried in, so that wasn't a problem for me at all, because he was buried in his yellow bunny suit. This little sleeper that was given to him at a baby shower. And I had pictures to prove that. But everyone went through the same process, you know, as far as remembering back what, you know, they could.
Making a positive ID requires matching specific and personal features like fingerprints, DNA, or unique traits in the skeleton with existing records or other known data. Relatives bring whatever medical or personal records they have to the Family Assistance Center. No one really knows what information will ultimately be helpful in making either a presumptive or positive ID.
The end of the fourth rib, just like you were saying. Those are the two methods.
Paul Sledzik, who came to Hardin with the Special Disaster Mortuary Response Team from Washington, explains the crew's process for collecting information.
Families would come in with either the medical records of their loved ones if they were deceased recently, or the recollections of what their loved ones' pathological conditions were like. And they'd list them on a form, we'd copy those down, we'd put them in a database. So when we got a particular unique feature on the body, we could search the database for that unique feature.
Now, how accurate do you think the medical records versus the recollections were?
Well, I recall a few cases talking to the coroner that the families would come in and claim that, let's say, their aunt had a healed fracture of her right hip, and then the husband would argue and say, no, it was the left hip. So there was a bit of ambiguity there. So that's why we were looking for things that were very, very unique, things like glass eyes, things like even the personal effects we used quite a bit.
But that would have to be contained within the coffin. Did you have a lot of personal effects that were strewn about the flood site?
There weren't many that were recovered. Most of the personal effects that we used were inside the casket, right? So they were contained with the body. They didn't get out. They weren't pushed up against another casket or anything like that.
The DMORT team soon realizes that in most cases, finding medical records or relatives with useful information is going to be next to impossible. But sometimes a little detective work yields results.
We had a young female skeletal remains that had an infant, and the anthropologist discovered that the woman's pelvic area was not as such that she would have been able to give natural birth to this child.
The anthropologist working with the crew said the bones showed that the woman probably had the child by cesarean section, and that the child died either at birth or shortly after.
This is probably one of the early burials in the cemetery, but we just kept following up on tidbits of information, and we used to have 2 or 3 of the older ladies in the area and the older men, and we'd go to them and ask them questions. Do you remember such and such or so and so? Oh, well, you know, now let's see, now so and so had a daughter that, yeah, by golly, she did. You become pregnant, and yeah, she died right at childbirth. And I think that did a cesarean section, you know.
What are their names, please?
Memories help in the identification process, but ultimately, the information the bones can offer is more reliable.
Over the years, anthropologists have learned that we can fine-tune, or at least attempt to fine-tune, some age ranges from some pretty unusual places in the skeleton.
Right, and we actually used that in Hardin. When we had mummified bodies or bodies that were partially decomposed, we did a cut down on the pelvic area to look at that pubic symphysis, and we do a cut down on the chest to look at the end of the fourth rib, just like you were saying. Those are the 2 methods that we've used for years and years and years, and they still held up here.
For Forensic anthropologists at Hardin create reports for the 32 individuals who have flesh remaining on their bones, many of whom are mummified. The reports include the approximate age at death, sex, estimated height, and probable ancestry. They also note any unique biological features and observable traumas, like broken bones. They also note how the person was placed in the casket, and what they were wearing, and any artifacts included with them, like jewelry, eyeglasses, or dentures.
What do we have here, Paul? Can you tell us about this?
This is one of the cases of metastatic carcinoma that we had from Hardin. It's really remarkable. This is one of the pelvic bones. And just for comparison, here's a normal, and you can see all the punched out lesions there. What's incredible about the cases that we had a metastatic carcinoma from Hardin is that every bone in the body was affected.
So this is cancer, and you can tell it's cancer, not just breakage from the flood or anything like that.
Right, it's very distinctive. You have these kind of eaten away areas, these round circular holes. The fact in these particular cases, the majority of the damage was in the pelvic area. We think it might be something like ovarian cancer. And these are cases from the 1920s, 1930s, so before the modern treatment techniques.
But it isn't just the bones, medical records, and family memories that help the forensic anthropologists identify the deceased. The caskets the dead are buried in also hold surprising clues. For weeks, the Harden Cemetery disaster crew compiles profiles of the dead based on information from family or friends. Their hope is to match this information with data gathered from studying the recovered remains.
I didn't get any identifying marks.
This is what you really need.
Exactly.
Like many of the town's residents, the Wolfs go to the Family Assistance Center daily to see if their loved ones, including their missing baby, had been found and identified.
He's not on this one.
They had a list posted who was found and who wasn't, if the caskets were marked or not, and if the name tag had come off of the caskets.
Although more than 200 caskets are retrieved from the 769 washed out graves, many have no name tags. But even without them, the caskets can still offer important information that might eventually help identify who was buried in them. Like cars or fashion, casket models have changed throughout the decades to appeal to prevailing tastes. Funeral director Vernie Fountain knows that if they can identify the caskets by model years, they can possibly connect the remains with information given by relatives.
If we can establish that, for lack of a better term, the make and the model, maybe the manufacturer, a little bit of the design, things like this might eliminate certain folks. In other words, John Doe perhaps died a certain date. Well, if this casket happened to be only made, after that date or something, it was obviously not John Doe. So it helped us with the process of elimination.
According to Paul Sledzik, the lead forensic anthropologist, the age of a casket doesn't necessarily correlate to the state of the remains found inside.
We had a few caskets, cast iron caskets, that dated to the late 1800s, early 1900s, that we actually had to blowtorch open because they were airtight seals. Mm-hmm. And when we broke those open and took the remains out for analysis, they were very well preserved. A lot of soft tissue preservation. Some of the soft tissues were still soft. Very to the point where almost like human skin. So that was pretty remarkable to have stuff that old to be that well preserved.
Yeah, I guess you can't exactly keep people.
Besides being the county coroner, Dean Snow is a funeral director. He had hoped that many of the caskets would contain memorial records about the deceased in a glass or metal tube that comes with many caskets.
Hey, Elizabeth, one of the things that the casket manufacturers started over 30-some years ago is they started incorporating an information sheet in a casket, which was this little piece of parchment with all the historical data of the deceased individual, and then this paper was all rolled up and placed in this little tube and then put back in the casket.
But Snow says they did not have the luxury of that information. There was a problem. When many of the tubes were checked, the paper rolled up in them had never been filled out. Every displaced casket found is opened in order to identify the remains inside. The condition of the individual determines which scientist performs the examination. Forensic pathologists examine well-preserved bodies. Anthropologists analyze the less well-preserved, the mummified or skeletonized remains. Of the 769 graves washed out by the flood, the crew in Hardin is able to positively identify 119 individuals. 145 graves are classified as black line. All that remains are dark lines in the soil 4 to 6 inches thick. Their contents disintegrated beyond any known means of identification. 486 remains are marked unknown. Of these, 40 are children.
They never found the relatives from the cemetery or identified them. They found remains, but we don't know that they were our remains of our family. My mother, she just took it badly. It haunted her. I think it was probably the end of her, is that her family was gone. They're not there no more. There's nothing to show that they were ever there, only my pictures.
Perhaps it is just luck or the land finally drying out. But alongside a road that had been repeatedly searched, a child's casket is spotted.
We were eating supper one evening in October, and the coroner called Dean Snow, and he said that they had found Christopher's casket along the road down by Little Breck Schoolhouse.
You found it?
He was the only one found in the family, and that everything was intact. You know, the casket and the vault and everything. He still had his name on it and everything. It was relief that he was found.
As winter approaches, the residents of Hardin are finally ready to put some measure of closure on their grief by reburying their dead. But first, they have the daunting task of rebuilding their cemetery. Four months after the Great Midwest flood devastated Harden, Missouri, the townspeople are ready to rebuild their historic cemetery and rebury their loved ones. Hundreds of new graves are needed. Some will carry a name once again. Others will simply be marked unknown. The middle of the cemetery is now scarred by a permanent lake that will forever remind residents of the flood's destruction. To make room for 480 new grave sites, the town purchases a cornfield adjacent to the old cemetery and bulldozes a 24,000 square foot area.
Human remains are placed in it. We did it much differently.
Bernie Fountain, the lead coordinator for the disaster recovery efforts, worked on mapping out the burial plots.
And we laid out 480 grave sites. This particular area here that's white, this was left vacant so that it would enable us to later inter additional human remains should they be found. And in fact, they were found. And eventually an additional 22 human remains were buried in this little white section down here. This pink section down here that you see is rather small, but this is all the infant graves that were unidentified. We wanted the operation to be much different than the common thought of what a mass grave is. These are individual grave sites. It just happens to be that we opened up one huge area in order to do it.
New vaults are arranged with identifying numbers. The numbers can be matched to the new post-mortem records created during the recovery and analysis process. This ensures that any future evidence recovered is used to identify someone recorded as unknown. The 119 individuals positively identified are placed in one section of the cemetery with new headstones. The 486 sets of remains that couldn't be identified are placed in graves marked unknown. On a cold day that December, nearly half a year after the flood, the town holds its memorial service.
I cried through the memorial service, as did many people who worked there, and put a lot of sweat into this thing. Very impressive. We, as a team that morning, went out to each unknown grave site and put one red rose on each unknown grave and one white rose on each infant grave.
Linda Wolf, who was unable to attend the first burial of her infant son, is now by her husband Ed's side.
And I remember we were there at the time designated for Christopher's burial. And of course, when you're at the cemetery, you can look up the road. And I was just constantly looking, you know, is that one Christopher? Is that truck coming? Is that Christopher, you know? And then when I looked up and I saw the wrecker with one small casket in it, then I knew that was Christopher. And sure enough, it came over and parked just a short distance of the place that was designated, you know, to rebury him. And the belts were put around the casket and it's picked up and just kind of dropped in the hole. So when the casket was lowered down, you know, you say a prayer, you say a few words, and you turn around and you leave.
Today, life in Hardin has pretty much returned to normal.
I just live with it. Because life goes on, you have to. You just have to.
As far as myself, I think that I've accepted it.
As for the crew that helped the town survive this tragedy and move on, there is a sense of pride.
I think for the people of Hardin, they just wanted an effort made. They didn't want this to be treated as a bunch of dead people, put them in a big hole in the ground and walk away. They wanted an effort made, and we were the professionals that were able to go in and provide that service for them.
The cemetery is a library of history, and I'll always remember that. When I visit the cemetery now, I think of all the history that was there, and hopefully a big portion of that has been returned there by the efforts of our team.
I think one of the best things that came from the disaster as far as the mortuary and funeral homes goes is that the state enacted that each body buried would be buried with a identification band either attached to an ankle or to a wrist. You know, nobody wants to ever have this happen again. But if it should happen again, why, at least identification should be a lot easier and a lot faster.
Two years after the flood, the cemetery is rededicated, and a granite monument is erected with the words, "Lest we forget." Death is supposed to be the final chapter in our lives. But in Harden, Missouri, the forces of nature conspired to rewrite the book. The dedicated work of the scientists who helped identify and rebury the dead in dignity brought a measure of closure and peace to the living.